it's fantastic to have such a big audience for what I'm sure is going to be an amazing talk tonight. Well over 300 people. So as Joe was saying though, during the talk, if you've got any technical issues, put those in the chat box. If you've got any questions and questions for Tim himself, put them in the Q&A box, please. And Dave will be monitoring the Q&A so that at the end of the talk, Tim can answer your questions. So anyway, tonight, thank you very much again for coming along. It's a real delight to have Tim Mackrill here to talk to us tonight. A lot of people in Leicestershire and the local counties will know Tim from his work with the Ospreys at Rutland Water. And he was working on that project for just over 10 years, apparently. In 2019, he moved on to work with the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation. And he's here tonight to talk about their work on reintroducing white-tailed eagles. And I'm sure all of us are really fascinated to hear all about that. So without any more ado, we'll hand over to Tim. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much, Kate, and hello to everyone. It's good to see people from not just Leicestershire and Rutland, but all around the country joining in the chat. So thank you very much. And hopefully you'll enjoy the next hour. I'm going to basically talk for about 45-50 minutes, and there'll be a bit of time for questions. There's a lot to get through in that time, so I hope I manage to keep the time, but I'll do my best to. Anyway, without further ado, I will share my screen. And well, you all know what you're here to listen to, but this is, I think, you know, a project that's a real privilege to be involved in. This is a project to restore one of our most iconic birds to southern England, a bird that's been absent for over 200 years. And I hope what this presentation will show you is what I see to be the real value of a proactive approach to the restoration of nature. And let's face it, we urgently need to do that at a time of a real ecological and climate emergency. Anyway, the project itself, I should say, is a partnership between the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation, who I work with, and Forestry England. And it's really relevant that I mention Roy Dennis, because Roy has been a real advocate of this kind of approach to conservation for his whole career. He's been working in nature conservation in this country for over 60 years. And as you'll see, he's been integral to the story of the white-tailed eagle right from the start. But I've got too much to get through to linger too much on anything in particular. So I just want to give you a brief introduction to the species, because I think it is important to set the scene about the history of the bird in the UK, and also some of the biology that's then relevant to why we feel that this reintroduction project is really important and really worthwhile. So it's an impressive bird, there's no doubt about that. If any of you have seen a white-tailed eagle, you'll know that the oft-used phrase of flying barn door is pretty appropriate. They've got a 2.5 meter wingspan, so they are a very sizable bird and pretty hard to miss if you have one flying overhead. But as you'll see as we go through the talk, they're amazingly inconspicuous for such a big bird, but more of that later. Females, like most raptors, are bigger than males, so females can weigh up to 6.5 kilograms, which is very big for a bird. So that just gives you an idea of the size and the scale of the species. And of course, it's the adult's distinctive white tail that gives it the species name. The other name, sea eagle, is relevant because they do inhabit, you know, coasts in many parts of their range, but they're also just as happy breeding around freshwater. Juveniles look a bit different. So if you've seen one of the Isle of Wight birds since release, then you won't have seen a white-tailed eagle with a white tail. You'll have seen something looking much more like this, which is a juvenile bird with this very distinctive brown plumage. In fact, I know some of you on the call on the Zoom tonight have been watching one of the Isle of Wight birds at Poole Harbour today, which is really nice. So hopefully you'll find out a bit more about that particular bird in a bit. Anyway, it takes white-tailed eagles about 4 years to attain 4 to 5 years to attain their full full adult plumage. So over the course of that period, from juvenile plumage right the way through to when they attain that full plumage, there's a kind of variances that you see each year, and it's possible to age individual birds by their stage of molt. And if you have a particularly good feather, it's quite clear to see the phase of the molt of that individual. But looking at the range of this species, it is a species that has a broad geographical distribution. So it ranges right the way from Greenland to northern Japan, and right the way south into the Middle East in places. There's a breeding population also in Turkey. So they go a long way south, and some non-breeding populations right down into India, northern India, and even Southeast Asia. So they have got a broad distribution. But I think it's like, as is the case with many birds of prey, they are recovering, and in fact they're recovering very well in parts of Europe, but their historical range was much greater than the current one that we see today. So they're absent from much of or large parts of Western and Southern Europe, and efforts are underway to restore them to other parts of the range as well. So there are 2 different projects proposed for different parts of Spain, and of course our work in the UK. And the white-tailed eagle is recovering, but in the UK it's still a very rare breeding species. It's on the red list of birds of conservation concern, and the UK government actually included the restoration of white-tailed eagles to England in its 25-year environment plan. So that was pretty significant in terms of getting the Isle of Wight project underway, and more of that later. But just a bit about the species biology. It's a generalist predator. It's an apex predator. It's right at the top of the food chain, but it has a very broad diet, and it tends to favour the most seasonally abundant prey, and that varies through the year. So fish are often favoured during spring and summer when they're most readily available, and white-tailed eagles, when they're catching fish, grab them from the surface or steal them from other species. So generally they need fish to be in either shallow water or very close to the surface for them to take them. But then as the year progresses and other potential prey becomes more seasonally abundant, then water birds and mammals often become a more key part of the diet in winter, and carrion's also very important. There was a recent study in Germany that showed that carrion constitutes about 30% of the diet in winter. So it's a species that really adapts its diet according to whatever is most seasonally abundant or most abundant in the landscape. And as I say, they don't just catch live prey, they take carrion, and they'll also rob species like large gulls and otters of food, also cormorants. So they're a real generalist, and that's one of the reasons that they do have this broad geographical distribution. When it comes to breeding, then in this country, you might readily kind of associate them with sea cliffs, because the population in Western Scotland is very much coastal, or the strongholds are anyway, and there they do nest on sea cliffs. But actually tree sites are usually preferred, and they tend to be in wooded areas close to water. But what we're now increasingly seeing through Europe as the species extends its range is that it's actually occupying many different habitats, and in some places like the Netherlands, in Poland, where there's a really strong, really healthy population of about 1,500 pairs now, they often nest just in isolated trees. So far from being a bird of, remote wild places, this is a species now that is really living alongside people and doesn't need vast tracts of forest to breed. It can nest even in an isolated tree. There's been lots of studies of their breeding habits around Europe. A study at the Danube Delta, for example, showed that they tend to favour large willows and poplar there. In Scotland, a range of species are used, so it can range from birch, oak, Scots pine, and they can be very big, tall, mature trees. But quite often the birds will choose a much smaller tree, just a small birch tree on a hillside, for example. So they're very variable, both in terms of where they breed and the trees they tend to use. And I think the really key thing in terms of the Isle of Wight project in particular is the fact this is a species that does readily breed close to human settlements. If you go online and search for urban white-tailed eagles in Helsinki, you'll see there's a pair in virtually central Helsinki, which really kind of might change your perceptions about where this species could breed in the future in the UK. In terms of their breeding biology, they tend to just produce 1 or 2 young every year, but they are a long-lived species. You know, they can live well into their 30s, perhaps even 40s. So this is a species that takes a while for them to reach sexual maturity. They normally don't breed till they're 5 or 6 years old, but then they can breed a long time into the future. Now, in terms of their former distribution in the UK, which is important, there's been quite a bit of research looking at various evidence, such as geographical place names interpreted as indicating the former presence, also archaeological records. And what that really indicates is that this is a bird that had a broad distribution across England. So they bred across the south coast, they bred through East Anglia, right the way through the Midlands. Basically, there's a paper a few years ago by Evans et al., which estimated the population many centuries ago could have been as high as 1,000 or 1,500 pairs. So this is a bird that, historically speaking, was widespread, but like many raptors, it was eradicated purely down to the influence of man, predominantly by persecution. And in southern England, the last pair bred on the Isle of Wight in 1780. So a fairly depressing and predictable story when it comes to the history of raptors in this country. But fortunately, there are individuals, Roy Dennis being key among them, and other people like Ian Newton, who really felt that this is a bird that we should be making efforts to restore. So just as in England, they went extinct in Scotland. It was later, it was around the start of the 20th century, but there was a 50-year period where there were no breeding white-tailed eagles in the UK. But in 1968, when Roy was the warden at Fair Isle and George Waterston was the head of the RSPB in Scotland, they got permission to move 4 young white-tailed eagles from Norway to Fair Isle Bird Observatory, to Fair Isle off the Scottish coast. And that was really significant because although that didn't work, what Roy was able to do with Waterston and others was to trial the techniques you might need to use to move the birds and to care for the birds and then release them. And that was really then the precursor to much more extensive, large-scale efforts to restore them to the west coast of Scotland, which took place between 1975 and 1998. And that involved a significant number of birds, which resulted in a breeding population becoming established on the west coast. A further 85 birds were then released on the east coast in Fife between 2007 and 2012. There's now somewhere in the region of 140 breeding pairs in Scotland, and the stronghold inevitably is that west coast. And you know, white-tailed eagles are synonymous with places like the Isle of Mull, the Isle of Skye, and in fact they're incredibly important for those areas because eagle tourism, and I'm sure some of you in the call tonight will have probably been to the Isle of Mull or Skye to see them. And if you have, then you've contributed very meaningfully to the local economy. Around 5 million to the Isle of Mull every year is generated through eagle tourism, and it's about 2.4 million to the Isle of Skye. So this is a bird that, you know, should be part of our landscape, but it's also a bird that can really kind of generate significant public interest and then have knock-on benefits for the local economy. So the story of the Scottish Reinduction is quite well known. Perhaps less well known is the ongoing efforts to restore the bird to Ireland, which is again relevant to our work on the Isle of Wight. 100 white-tailed eagles were moved from Norway to Killarney National Park in southwest Ireland over a 5-year period between 2007 and 2012, and that was basically replicating the techniques that have been used in Scotland. There's now a small population of 9 to 10 breeding pairs established, and significantly last year the first wild-fledged chick actually bred successfully itself. So that was a real milestone for the project, and shows that the population is slowly beginning to work towards being self-sustaining. They have taken the decision to undertake 3 more years of releases to boost the expanding population, because there was a period where they lost several key adult birds to various causes, which knocked the population back a bit to begin with. But these additional releases, plus the wild-fledged birds that are starting to breed themselves, should hopefully ensure that the population is secure. And I think one of the really significant things about the work that's been done in Ireland is how perceptions of this bird have changed over the course of the project so far. So when it was first proposed, because of the ongoing controversy with white-tailed eagles in Scotland, which I'm not going to go into any detail now purely because of time, but you'll know full well some of the arguments that have taken place. And because of that, there were protests when the Irish project was first proposed, particularly among the farming community. But the Irish project have worked very, very hard to engage with the farming community, and you'll see there from that headline in the Irish press that those protests have really developed into partnerships, and now there are farmers who are helping to monitor breeding pairs, and the bird is not causing the problems that were initially perceived. So that's significant, and I'll come on to that a bit later. The other thing is that this is a bird that is now recovering in Europe. So if you look at where white-tailed eagles breed, you know, the perception, and something that people said to us when we first proposed the project on the Isle of Wight was, well, hang on, this is a bird of remote places. You know, you think of the Isle of Mull, you know, what, you know, staggeringly beautiful place, and very remote, but really not what you would, certainly not a comparison you'd then make with the densely populated south coast of England. But if you look across Europe, there are plenty of examples of this species coexisting very happily close to people. And the Netherlands is a really good example. So there are now 20 breeding pairs in the Netherlands, and those birds have spread from places like Germany, where there's somewhere in the region of 650 to 700 pairs. And they've spread slowly into the Netherlands and colonized some of the, you know, fantastic freshwater wetlands that they've got there. And Roy and I felt that it would be really significant to understand how the birds are living in that landscape. So while we were working on the Isle of Wight feasibility study, we went across and we met some of the researchers working with white-tailed eagles in the Netherlands, and we saw them in a landscape like this. This is a place called Kramer-Volkerak, which is south of Rotterdam. And in fact, this photograph is actually taken from the hard shoulder of a motorway, which really kind of puts things in perspective. If you look at that line of trees, there's a nest halfway up on the right hand side of the island, and that is a nest that's been used for a number of years by white-tailed eagles. So it really does show you that this is a species that can prosper in densely populated areas. As I said, there were 20 breeding pairs in 2020, and there's been a lot of really useful information gathered by the Dutch researchers who are monitoring the expanding population, and particularly they've looked very closely at the diet of the birds during the summer, and they found that, you know, like many parts of the bird's range, the diet does vary with season and also kind of spatio-temporally in the landscape. But water birds tend to be favoured, about 58% of the diet, followed by fish. But there is evidence that fish are preferred when they're available, and that really just depends where the birds are actually breeding. When it comes to water birds, the most significant species are grey-lag goose, and that's particularly grey-lag goose goslings and coot. So two relatively easily caught species, certainly when you're talking about gosling geese. And in fact, one of the positive stories that the Dutch told us about the return of white-tailed eagles is how they have controlled the populations of some of the feral geese, which were becoming very, very numerous and widespread. So that's undoubtedly, you know, the recovery of white-tailed eagles in the area has reinstated you know, an apex predator that had been absent, and had allowed species like grey-lag geese, which don't have any other natural predators, to really expand. So that's significant. The other really significant thing is that across Europe, there is no conflict with sheep or other livestock farming. This is a bird where natural prey availability is high. It coexists really happily with people. So we started to build up this evidence base of how the species might live in southern England. And again, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but we put together a detailed feasibility study looking at the south coast, and particularly the Isle of Wight and surrounding areas. And we felt there was a really strong ecological case to restore the bird. There is always the argument that you could wait for the birds to recolonize naturally. But when you look at, especially when you consider that there are an increasing number of white-tailed eagles appearing particularly in spring from continental Europe. But if you look at the breeding biology of the species, you do get these young birds wandering very, huge kind of exploratory flights up to 1,000 kilometers from their natal nest in the first 2 years. But as they near breeding age, they nearly always return to their natal site. So in Scotland, most young white-tailed eagles will breed within 50 kilometers of the nest they were reared in. And of course, what that means is that the geographical expansion is slow. And then when you factor in, continental birds have to also cross the sea, which is a barrier to a bird with the morphology of the white-tailed eagle, a big, heavy eagle, then of course it becomes more difficult. And we felt that because the techniques for the restoration of the species are now well known because of the work in Scotland and Ireland, that we did have a really good opportunity to restore this bird back to the area where it last bred in the late in 1780. So to cut a very long story short, and it was a long story short, we got permission from Natural England and Scottish Natural Heritage to begin a project in 2019, and that followed the feasibility study, which also included a detailed public consultation. And there was a lot of support. There was local support was somewhere in the region of 75 to 80%. But it is important to mention that there were people with concerns, particularly among the farming community. And we were very keen that we wanted to work very closely with them right from the outset. And so we have a project steering group that includes a diverse range of stakeholders, including farming community, but also tourism, local council, the conservation bodies. And that's really to make sure that all key stakeholders have got an influence in how the project is being managed, which we feel is integral to the success of these kind of initiatives. Anyway, the first 6 young eagles were moved in 2019, and they were held in special pens in a quiet location in the Isle of Wight, and then released in mid-August. And then we moved and released a further 7 birds in 2020. So the project is still in its infancy, but it's underway. And it's interesting, the processes that we now use for the collection and then the care and then the release of the white-tailed eagles have really been honed over a number of years. When you think right back to 1968, when Roy Dennis first did this work, and this video is taken from just about the first nest where we collected birds from in northern Scotland in 2019, and we were there with Roy. And I think that just shows you the influence that particular person has had on the conservation of this species in the UK. Anyway, so we collect the birds when they're somewhere in the region of 7 to 9 weeks old, by which time they're about 3/4 grown. And this is my colleague Fraser Cormack going up one of the trees with a big nest in the top. And when Fraser gets to the top of the nest, he's faced with this. So 2 white-tailed eagles. One of these birds, the bird on the right there, is G324, which is one of the birds which is now on the Isle of Wight and still doing very well. So that was, quite a nice video to include. But Fraser and Ian, Ian Perks, who also helps us with the collection, is very, very skilled at climbing the trees, but then actually managing to very carefully take hold of one of the birds and lower it to the ground. And of course, you have to really, it's such a responsibility doing this work that you really need people who are very, very careful in how they handle the birds and take, every consideration into, the bird's kind of welfare at all times. And there is Fraser back on the ground with the bird. So that just gives you an idea of the size. And bear in mind, this is just about 3/4 grown. Now, after being collected in Scotland, the birds are then moved to the Isle of Wight. And in the first year, we transported them by road. Fraser and I drove them overnight. But happily, in 2020, when, of course, COVID struck and things were looking more difficult, we actually were helped out fantastically by a guy with a plane who volunteered to fly the birds with his daughter, who had experience of caring for birds of prey, which was just incredibly lucky, who also lived in the same household as him. So we were able to follow all the COVID guidelines. And Graham Mountford, his name is, and his daughter flew them from Inverness Airport right the way down to Bembridge on the Isle of Wight, which took just about 2 hours compared to a 11-12 hour journey by road, which was far, far better for the birds. And then once the birds are on the Isle of Wight, then there's a really key job. And the person in charge of looking after them on the Isle of Wight is a guy called Steve Egerton-Reid, who's the project officer. And Steve's responsibility, his key responsibility at that time of year is to feed the birds. But a crucial thing at this stage is that they have absolutely no human contact. So the last thing we want is for these birds to be habituated to people. So basically there's a solid rear to the back of the pens, and that means that Steve can put food in, and it's predominantly fish and rabbit that we feed them. He spoons it in with a big trowel, and it drops down onto the nest, and that ensures that the birds have, you know, as much food as they want, but they're not seeing people, they're not associating people with food. And then we're able to monitor them remotely via CCTV. So that just means that those birds are being kept as wild as possible, which is absolutely key. And they grow and they develop very quickly. So this is just a few weeks after they've arrived on the Isle of Wight. You can see the release pens are very large, and basically we hold them a bit longer than they would stay in a natural nest, and that's to allow them to kind of branch out, as we're seeing here, and to ensure that when they are released, they're in really, really strong, good condition, which is absolutely crucial, obviously, because they are in a more artificial environment in terms of, you know, not having their parents there. So that's a key thing to think about. And just before they are released, then we have a vet, John Chitty, who's an expert on birds of prey, who comes and checks them all and clears them for release. And I wanted to show you this photo, A, because John is a really integral member of the team, but B, because you can really see why those wings, why they're called flying barn doors. That is a pretty sizable wing. When it comes to releasing them, it's a case again of minimizing human contact. So we're able to release, lower the front of the pens using a wire, so the front door opens without the birds seeing someone's opening it, and that then gives them the chance to fly out and hopefully not go too far. Those two birds went really quickly, but others just sit and look at the open door and take some time to go. But the key thing is that you don't want to flush them. You want them to take their own time and to fly out at their kind of own volition. And that's what we saw. And these are all things you refine, but we actually released the birds a bit earlier this last year, and that worked fantastically well, because all of the birds we released, the 7 birds, remained at the release site then for about 6 weeks before they started dispersing away. And there are these various perches just near the release pens that provide a really safe environment for them. Now, that phase is an incredibly important phase, because clearly you need to release the birds in good condition for them to stand any real chance of surviving. And our long-term aim with the project is that we hope that a population of somewhere in the region of 6 to 8 pairs will become established initially in an area within about 50 kilometers of the release site. So this map and that semicircle there shows you the approximate area that we expect these birds to settle to breed. So those of you from Poole Harbour are watching will notice that Poole Harbour is in the likely settlement area, which hopefully is quite exciting for you. There's lots of suitable habitat on the south coast of England, lots of estuaries which we know are full of species like grey mullet, which are already proving to be very important for the Isle of Wight birds. You might think 6 to 8 pairs isn't many, but that's mainly because we looked at the survival of birds released in Scotland, and it was somewhere in the region of 35 to 40% to 5 years. And that's the crucial thing, of course. They have to survive to that age before they start breeding. So we think 60 birds is enough to establish that initial population, and then hopefully they start to spread in time to other areas. But before they reach breeding age, what we find is that young white-tailed eagles are very nomadic. So they stay close to the release site for some time, and likewise birds in natural nests will stay with their parents for a number of months after they've fledged. But then slowly but surely they get the urge to start wandering. And I'm sure that you're probably all aware of the satellite tracking we've been able to do with the Isle of Wight birds, and it really has been fascinating to follow them. And satellite tracking is really important. We fit all of the birds before release with a transmitter, and the ones we use are manufactured by a company called Ornitella, who are based in Lithuania, and the transmitters are really fantastic. They work through the mobile phone network, and it means that we can collect incredibly highly detailed information. So we can log the bird's location as regularly as once every minute during the summer, when the solar panels on the top of the transmitter top the battery up. It's not quite so frequent in winter, when you have to try and conserve the battery life a bit more, but the tags so far are working very well, and they really are giving us an amazing insight into the journeys and the explorations of the young birds before, you know, they reach the age when they're thinking about settling to breed. And they're also helping us to understand how these young birds are living in the landscape. And so I wanted to talk a bit about the travels of some of the particular individuals, and I'm going to focus on the birds released in 2019, because, you know, we know much more about them because they've now been on the wing for nearly 2 years, and we're really understanding a lot about how they're living in the landscape, and how they're adapting to life in southern England. And G393, which is the bird that's currently at Poole Harbour, is really noticeable because it's the one that's travelled most extensively. So it left the Isle of Wight on the 8th of September in 2019. So that was about a month after release. And it then spent the next 17 months wandering all over northern, central and eastern England. And you'll see there just how detailed the GPS tracking is, because we logged 71,000 positions for it in that time. And the track there that you can see on the map is 4,904 kilometres. So that bird has seen a good deal of England over the last year and a half. But there are 3 key areas really that it spent time in during that period away from the Isle of Wight. The first one was in its first winter, when it flew up to Oxfordshire. And it spent a good deal of the winter in a flooded river valley on the Oxfordshire-Buckinghamshire border. And again, the satellite tracking data enabled us to, you know, look at how it was moving in the landscape, how quite often it had a very small kind of home range. But then the really key thing is then to use that data to go and see the bird in the field, and to really understand how it's living, and to do things like check roost sites. So we're able to go to regularly use roost sites because the satellite data shows us where that bird is spending each night. And then we can start doing things like looking for prey remains. And a good example is this photograph that we took in March last year, when Steve and I went to see the bird and to look at the roost site. And there you can see that we found the remains of black-headed gull, mallard, pigeon, pheasant, and corvid feathers. So that just gave a good indication of the birds they were taking, but also there was a lot of rabbit fur. And something that we're seeing increasingly with all the birds is that they do tend to favour areas with really high rabbit, or in some cases brown hare abundance. So that is quite key for the future. But it was quite clear that a lot of the food that bird was taking in its first winter was just scavenged. This is an area, of course, that's that really if you want to look at raptors, then you don't have to look very far, because there are abundant populations of red kites, buzzards, lots of ravens as well. And so a lot of the food that bird was taking, pheasants, for example, are likely to be scavenged carcasses from the landscape. But probably there were instances when it was starting to catch live prey. You know, it's almost certainly catching some of the rabbits live. So it's interesting to see how its diet was beginning to change. Then in spring last year, it set off on some amazing exploration. So over the course of 6 weeks, between kind of mid-March and the end of April, it covered something like 1,500 kilometres over much of western, central, eastern, and then northern England. And it eventually ended up in the North York Moors. And it then spent 2 months in the North York Moors, and was seen by actually a comparatively few people, but there were a couple of local raptor monitors who kindly went out and looked for the bird in the landscape for us, which was brilliant. And we also established some good relationships with some of the landowners living up there, which was really crucial as well. So one of the areas that the birds favoured in was this valley. I'm not going to specifically go into names at the moment, because of course these are all areas that birds could go back to in the future, but this is a valley in the North York Moors. And the really notable thing about this valley, when we started talking to some of the local people, and from some of the people going to see the birds, was the fact that there was really high rabbit abundance. And when we started looking at the satellite data, you could see that this bird had a very, very small home range. Just literally, it was covering an area of just a couple of square kilometers at times, particularly during May. And that's because it was sitting in this tree-lined valley, and it was just able to drop down and catch rabbits, which were just numerous. So it was a very, very easy life for it. And in fact, it was such a good area that in June, it was actually joined by a second bird from the Isle of Wight, G318, which was another bird released in 2019. And in fact, these two were actually in the same release pen on the Isle of Wight. So they were two birds that knew each other, and they spent virtually the whole of June together in that particular valley. So that was really interesting to see. Anyway, after a few months in the North York Moors, G393 decided to head south, and it actually relevant tonight because it then flew south through Leicestershire, and it had a few days in rural Leicestershire before it then flew across to West Norfolk. And it then spent the next 5 months in West Norfolk. And this is significant because, of course, you might well know about the projects that's proposed at Kenhill, basically in this area where this bird spent 5 months. And while it was in West Norfolk, it was interesting because it favoured two key areas. And one of the places it went to was an estate inland, but this estate had an inland reservoir which is used for kind of water supply for local agriculture, and that reservoir was the kind of focal point of that bird's while it was in this particular area. And again, this just shows you the value of the satellite data. So when it started, this is the West Acre estate in Norfolk, and I can happily talk about them. They've been really, really supportive of the project. And when the birds first pitched up there, we noticed it started going to this reservoir on a daily basis. But of course, you can't really tell what the bird's doing just by looking at the satellite data. So we needed to actually get out there. So I went across to Norfolk and visited the site with Fraser Bradbury, who's ecologist and forester on the estate. And immediately we found why the bird was there. It was stacked full of black-headed gulls. And these black-headed gulls were actually going out and feeding on pig fields in the local area during the day, and then they were coming to roost on the reservoir and also bathe and wash in the reservoir during the day. So that seemed to be the likely prey, but obviously that's no guarantee. So we then went to some of the regular roost sites and favoured daytime perches, and immediately we found lots of evidence of the remains of black-headed gulls. And in fact, that pattern then continued for the next few weeks. Black-headed gulls were basically the bird's key prey item for the next few weeks while it was in the area. So that was really interesting, and it just showed the value of the satellite data in understanding how this bird was living. You know, we're getting their positions every 2-3 minutes, so you really start to build up a very detailed picture of the bird and how it's living in the landscape. Then as the autumn turned into winter, this bird started to spend more time around the Wash, and from the 4th of November in particular, the Wash became its kind of focal point, and it would fly out onto the mudflats whenever the weather was good. So if it was a good day, it would fly out onto the mudflats, and it was often looking for carrion. It was seen feeding on a dead seal on one particular occasion, and in fact, it went out onto the mudflats on 29 of 49 days that it was in the area. So it was interesting to see how it was kind of adapting its behaviour. But again, even in this area, an area where there's a lot of bird watchers, it was seen only very sporadically. And one of the reasons it was seen sporadically is that, yes, it did fly out onto the mudflats, but white-tailed eagles spend the vast majority of their time perched. And I'll come on to this a bit later. They're often spending time just in quiet wooded areas. And even if they do fly out onto mudflats, they're often just perched on the ground, and they can be incredibly inconspicuous for such a big bird. Anyway, after spending 5 months in West Norfolk, the bird then headed back slowly towards the Isle of Wight, and it took it about somewhere in the region of about 4 weeks to fly south. It went through Lincolnshire, then back through Leicestershire again into Northants. It was seen by quite a few people at Pitsford Reservoir, which created a lot of excitement there. And then further south, it continued down through the home counties, and eventually back to the Isle of Wight, and it got back to the Isle of Wight 17 months to the day that it had left. So that was a really notable moment. It then remained on the Isle of Wight for a couple of weeks until I think it was Sunday when it flew across to Poole Harbour, and it's been in Poole Harbour since. So it will be interesting to see what the bird's next move is, but I know that those of you who have been watching the bird at Poole have been really pleased to see it. So that's really excellent. Now, to just demonstrate the individuality of white-tailed eagles, I'm going to compare G393 with another of the birds that we released in 2019, G274. So this is another male. This bird was translocated from the Isle of Skye in 2019, but its behaviour has been totally different. So whereas G393 went off for 17 months, this bird has stayed much more local. It spent the vast majority of its time on the Isle of Wight, and in fact it's just had 3 longer journeys away, but each of those longer journeys has only been 5 to 6 days. It's been across to Kent on 2 occasions through Sussex, and then on another occasion it flew along the south coast as far as Devon, and then back up through Somerset and Wiltshire back to the Isle of Wight. But essentially that bird has remained on the Isle of Wight since released, and that bird has been really key in helping us to understand how the birds are living in the landscape on the south coast of England, and particularly because this bird tends to favour estuarine sites around the Isle of Wight, and because of the diet that it's kind of now becoming apparent. So I guess the first real change we noticed in its first winter, this bird was largely surviving on carrion, like white-tailed eagles tend to do in their first winter. But spring last year, there was a clear change. As the grey mullet came into the estuaries around the coast of the Isle of Wight, the bird started catching mullet in the estuaries, and it was seen catching mullet on an almost daily basis. And then that continued really the whole way through the summer. And really interestingly, during the summer, it also started catching cuttlefish, common cuttlefish that were coming into the seagrass beds just off the coast of the Isle of Wight to spawn. And so, you know, this is an example of an seasonally abundant prey that suddenly becomes available, and the white-tailed eagles take advantage of it. So that was a potentially novel prey item. We're not sure if we haven't found evidence of cuttlefish being taken elsewhere. So that was really interesting. And this coastal behavior has just continued for the whole year. And most noticeably really is the fact that this bird has continued to catch fish right the way through the winter. So this is some satellite data from the south coast of the Isle of Wight, near Blackgang, which some of you will perhaps be familiar with. And again, this satellite data shows that this bird has been fishing off the coast, and in some cases it's going a long way out to sea. It's going up to 4.5 kilometers out to sea, and this is in the middle of winter. So this is between November and the 5th of February. It was out in this area fishing off the coast on 33% of days, on a third of days, which is really significant because it shows you the availability of prey in southern England. And the vast majority of fish it was catching were bass, which are often feeding on shoals of smaller fish which congregate on shelves just off the Isle of Wight there. And it wasn't just G274, so G324, another of the 2019 birds, was behaving likewise. And we started to hear from the local fishermen that they were actually getting some really close views of the birds diving down and catching fish close to their boats. And in fact, you'll know that in some parts of Scotland, notably in Mull and Skye, fishermen have now make good money by taking wildlife photographers out to see white-tailed eagles taking fish chucked from the back of the boats. Well, one of the crab fishermen off the Isle of Wight actually chucked some fish remains off the back of his boat in February, and the white-tailed eagle came and picked it up. So maybe in years to come, that's something we're going to see on the south coast as well, which is really exciting, because that's when you start to see the local community really benefiting from the presence of the birds. And what's noticeable about how this bird is now behaving is how its behavior has changed. So whereas in winter 1920, so its first winter, it was very much dependent on carrion. It was spending long periods inland, probably only about a quarter of days at the coast. there's been a clear shift this last winter. So over half of days it's spent in coastal locations, and it tended to only stay inland if it was just very poor weather. And whenever it's at the coast, it's looking to catch fish. So there's a real significant reduced dependence on carrion as the birds become older and they become capable of catching live prey. And in fact, since the 1st of February, this bird's changed again. It's gone to another site near the coast of the Isle of Wight where it's caught some freshwater fish, but also coot. And one day last week, it actually caught a Canada goose, an adult Canada goose, but an injured Canada goose. So that just shows you that the experiences in Netherlands are already starting to be replicated in southern England. And I just wanted to show you this photo because I think it's an important point, that this is not the best photo of a white-tailed eagle you'll ever see, but it's a significant one because this was taken on someone's mobile phone while they were paragliding over Butser Hill in the South Downs. And this paraglider got in touch. He was absolutely elated because he'd been paragliding, and it got into a thermal over Butser Hill, and he'd circled up in this thermal, and as he did, he was joined by a couple of buzzards, a red kite, and then the white-tailed eagle. And apparently at one point, you wouldn't know it from the photo, but the white-tailed eagle was within 30 meters, and he said it's one of the best experiences he's ever had as a paraglider. And I think something we're really starting to see is just how excited people have been to see this amazing bird in southern England. So you know, it's a bird that during the coronavirus lockdown last year, people were seeing from their back gardens, and that was just fantastic. So it's really, really exciting to hear how, you know, many people are getting real pleasure from seeing this amazing bird back in the landscape again. And then just finally, the final 2019 bird I want to talk about briefly is G324. So this is the one that you saw the video of in its natal nest. And this one, again, is significant because last winter it spent the whole time on the Isle of Wight. But then in late May last year, it did a really long flight up to Northumberland. It flew up to Northumberland in just 2 days. And it flew up there when there were really strong southerly winds. And they tend to make these long exploratory flights when they've got a tailwind. Flew up to Northumberland, and then it went right up to the Firth of Forth. And I remember one day we got the data and we saw it was on the Firth of Forth, and we thought, oh dear, you know, this bird's going to go back to Western Scotland and, you know, rejoin its natal population. But it then turned round and it went to the Lammermuir Hills, and it spent 2 months in the Lammermuir Hills. And interestingly, again, it was favouring an area in the Lammermuir Hills when there was really high rabbit abundance. So I went to one of the key locations it was spending all its time, and rather than being out on the open moors, it was actually just down in the lower valleys. And this particular area it was favouring, there was a huge rabbit warren with masses of rabbits. So again, it just shows you how the abundance of rabbits was actually having a key influence on the distribution of these birds as they start dispersing and exploring the landscape. Anyway, going back to the map, after 2 months in the Lammermuir Hills, that bird then slowly made its way back south across the border into Northumberland and then back through England. And over the course of a couple of weeks, it made fairly leisurely progress back to the Isle of Wight and actually back to the release site. And when it got back to the release site in early September, it met another cohort of young eagles that had just been released. So we started to see the kind of differing age classes mixing, which was really exciting. And G324 has remained on the Isle of Wight since. And again, she's going to estuarine sites. She's also catching fish in the sea. So she's behaving very much like G274. The other thing that I just wanted to kind of show you with that photo is how we're starting to see the local breeding and wintering birds becoming habituated to the presence of white-tailed eagles. So there were some concerns when the project was first proposed that, you know, reintroducing this big apex predator would create a lot of disturbance for, you know, some of the big wintering bird assemblages that you get on the Solent, and also say breeding colonies of terns and gulls. But we've actually not seen any of that, and that's largely because the birds are incredibly sedentary. They sit for the vast majority of their time, as you'll see in a minute, but also because these wintering birds quickly become habituated to their presence. So that's hopefully the kind of evidence which it's needed to just assure people that this is a bird that can be successful in England once again. And this is G324 with a bass that she just caught off the Blackgang coast. So in terms of the diet, you'll have gathered that we're starting to build up a really detailed picture of what the birds are feeding on. So on the Isle of Wight and around the south coast, marine fish are really important. So grey mullet, European bass and black bream are the key ones. But they've also learned to catch cuttlefish, which is really interesting. And just recently, as I mentioned, G274 has also caught freshwater fish elsewhere. So again, we're seeing that the indications we get from Europe that fish are favoured when they're available, that is proving to be the case. Another key prey item are rabbits and brown hares. And again, as I mentioned, the movements of these 29 birds has been strongly influenced by local abundance of those two species, particularly rabbits. Black-headed gulls, we're seeing them catching black-headed gulls on a regular basis, but also some other water birds, and particularly mallard and coot seem to be the two main ones. Then carrion is very important in the first winter in particular. So these are either scavenged water birds, which the birds might find along the strand line, maybe washed up dead fish, maybe even marine mammals or cetaceans, but also game birds. So they do spend time around game shooting estates, and we've actually had some very good support from some of the game shoots on the Isle of Wight, who have actually been very pleased to see the birds, which has been really great to hear. They also take corvids, so we often find the remains of corvids in regularly used roost sites, and also wood pigeons. So you can see there that it's a broad diet, just what you'd expect of white-tailed eagles. Another thing that the satellite tracking specifically has shown us is just how stationary these birds can be. So this just shows you the proportion of time that the birds spend perched, because each GPS location we get from the transmitter logs whether the bird is actually moving or not. So you can very quickly estimate the proportion of time that the bird is spent stationary. You'll see there that on average they spend about 92% of time each day perched, and that's one of the reasons that they don't really disturb some of the big, of course occasionally they will fly across a wetland and lots of birds get up, but because they don't actively hunt like that much, the disturbance is actually far less than you might expect. So you can see there that it's that the percentage of each day they spend flying is actually quite low. So this is kind of really, really detailed and useful information, which helps us to understand how the birds are living in the landscape. And this is actually very relevant because it really kind of corroborates with previous research that's been done on white-tailed eagles. So there was a study in Germany that showed that they spent around 93.2% of time perched, and similarly with the very closely related bald eagle in North America, it's 94.3%. So you can see that although it's a bird with a vast, immense wingspan, they spend very long periods sat in quiet locations, and so as a result they can be very, very inconspicuous in the landscape. But the other thing is really just how widely they have dispersed, how much the young birds have explored and ranged widely. And here's just a summary of where they've gone. So the four surviving birds from 2019 have ranged as far as East Lothian, as we mentioned, up to 600 kilometres from the release site. But even some of the 2020 birds are now starting to wander quite widely as well. We had two birds, G463 and G471, who went all the way down to Land's End last year. And I mentioned that last autumn, and I mentioned that the winds are really kind of influential in determining where they end up. And those birds basically flew along the west along the south coast in really strong easterly winds. So then they effectively flew as far as they could, right to the end of the Cornwall, the Lizard Peninsula, and then came back. And they spent their whole winter in the southwest, but both birds have now moved back into central England. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the coming weeks with them. And we expect these 2020 birds to behave just as the 2019 birds are. So some of these birds won't now return to the Isle of Wight probably until next spring. So, you know, wherever you are in the country, there is a chance you might see them. But then as they approach breeding age, just like G393 did, we expect that they will return to the Isle of Wight. And that's what we're seeing with the 4 birds from 2019. So G324 went up to East Lothian, came back. G393 went as far north as North Yorkshire, came back. G274 has remained pretty local throughout. And G318 also went to North Yorkshire. Then she spent most of the winter in Lincolnshire, but she's now coming south as well. So it looks like she's probably on her way back to the Isle of Wight. And that's the key thing. The breeding biology of the species means they are likely to come back to the south coast despite these explorations, and that's where they'll settle to breed. So finally, just some concluding remarks. The fact that they are so remarkably inconspicuous has been a very notable finding, really. They spend a lot of time perched in quiet areas, wooded areas, where they can be very inconspicuous. And as a result of these habits, the local breeding and wintering birds become habituated to their presence. And again, this is something that the Dutch researchers have noticed as well. There's no problems with white-tailed eagles predating breeding terns or gulls because they learn to avoid those colonies where they just get mobbed. So, you know, they do fit into the landscape very well. Carrion is very important during the first winter. In fact, it's, you know, forms the bulk of the diet. But then as the birds become older and they're better able to catch live prey, that's preferred. So they prefer to catch fish, or they prefer to catch water birds, because nutritionally, of course, it's much more valuable. Fish is readily available around the coast of the Isle of Wight throughout the year, and that's really notable. We knew it would likely be the key prey item in spring and summer. What we're now seeing is that there are, you know, there's probably higher abundance of potential prey than we first imagined. So that's really encouraging. The other thing is that the immature birds have favoured areas with high rabbit and hare abundance. So that means that they can linger in inland areas for some periods, and I'm particularly now talking about the young birds in their first explorations around the Isle of Wight. And really crucially, the fact that they do disperse such long distances and come back. And finally, really, it's just been fantastic to see the thrill people have had at seeing these birds back in England again. Yes, there was a chance of seeing white-tailed eagles before, because, you know, continental birds occasionally come over from Europe, and we're actually seeing an increasing amount of that. And in fact, we hope that some of those continental birds will eventually join the population, and they're much more likely to stay if there are breeding white-tailed eagles here already. Conspecific attraction is very important for the species. So that's significant. But there was a chance of seeing white-tailed eagles before, but of course your chances are now much greater. And, you know, we have been really kind of quite overwhelmed with the positivity that we've had. But also I think it's important to recognise that we've also had a lot of support for the project from different stakeholder groups who were wary of the project to begin with and had their doubts, but who are now, you know, providing some really good support. So we've had lots of good support from farmers on the Isle of Wight, also from some of the game shooting areas. So that's really pleasing, and we are very keen that that's the approach we want to take with this project. We want to work with local people, whether they're interested in wildlife or whether they've got other interests as well. So that's going to be key to the long-term success, and will be an integral part of the project, not just for this release phase, but also then as the birds start to breed, and for many years to come. You know, this is a long-term project, and we're absolutely fully committed to it in the long term. So I've tried to keep to my hour. Thank you all very much for listening. If you want to know more, then have a look on the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation website, roydennis.org. And I should particularly mention one of the photographers whose photos feature very heavily tonight, Ainsley Bennett, who's a local photographer on the Isle of Wight, who's documented the birds fantastically well for us since release. So if you get a chance, just Google Ainsley Bennett and you'll see some of his fantastic, not just white-tailed eagle photos, but landscape photos as well. But yeah, I guess that's probably about where we are at the moment. I hope you've enjoyed it, and perhaps we might have a few questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen and see if we've got any. I think there might be someone who needs to tell me the questions, hopefully.
Right. Thanks ever so much, Tim. That was absolutely fascinating talk, absolutely fascinating. I remember my first white eagle sighting on the island of Mull quite some years ago now, and we'd just driven off the ferry there and this barn door flew over, and it was one of those real wow moments in life, actually. So I understand that. There are an awful lot of questions coming in, so if I could make a start, we've had, I've tried to group them. We've had a couple here, one from Valerie Webber and one from Ian Cooper, about the possibility of reintroduction of the white-tailed eagle into Wales. And also related to that, really, what's the possibility of their impact on ospreys? Is there likely to be very much competition there?
Yeah, good point. Well, that's relevant to me, particularly given my interest in ospreys. Yeah, there's a Sophie Lee Williams did her PhD on the feasibility of restoring white-tailed eagles and golden eagles to Wales, and she's done an incredibly detailed and very thorough job of it, and identified several areas that would be suitable for a reintroduction. So that those efforts hopefully are ongoing, and as I say, Sophie's really done a very good job. So a thorough study, and hopefully something that will happen, because of course, you know, when you're looking at, you know, re-establishing a bird like the white-tailed eagle in Britain, if you have a number of different meta populations, then of course it just greatly increases the chances of the population becoming really established and robust. So, you know, very much hope that does happen. And some of the estuaries on the coast of Wales, just like the south coast of England, be highly suitable for them. But yeah, have a look at some of Sophie's work. It's really good. In terms of relationship with ospreys, I mean, you know, these are two species that coexist in many parts of the world. There are indications sometimes that ospreys, if the white-tailed eagles settle in an area, then the ospreys avoid the areas where the white-tailed eagles are, because they know that the eagles will try and pinch their fish. So there's been a bit of that seen in some parts of Russia, for example. But there's little in the way of negativity other than that. So, you know, these are two species that have evolved together, coexist in many parts of their range. So we don't think it's going to be a problem. In fact, we just think, you know, what an amazing thing to see. I mean, I was very jealous of Jim Baldwin. I don't know if he's listening tonight, but Jim was on the Isle of Wight last autumn, and he actually saw a white-tailed eagle trying to steal a fish from an osprey. And I thought, well, you know, that is just fantastic. Two birds that have been restored to the south coast of England. You know, just really exciting. So yeah, hopefully two species that are going to prosper, both species that like grey mullet, but I think there's room for both in the years to come.
Excellent, thanks. And a couple of questions really. One here from Simon Bennett, interested in the isolated populations of white-tailed eagles, and is there any risk of inbreeding? And there's actually been a few questions about that, one with the possibility of interbreeding with siblings and this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's always an important consideration with a reintroduction, the fact that you do need to take the initial birds for release from a very broad, as broad an area as possible, from as many different nests as possible, so you reduce the chances of inbreeding. So that's something we're doing. The other thing is that one thing we do hope is that as a population becomes established, say on the south coast, that some of these wandering birds from continental Europe might be persuaded to stay. I think the fact is that if there are no white-tailed eagles there resident breeding, these young birds will inevitably eventually end up back in the places they came from, so they'll just return to their natal site. But there is a much greater chance of them staying and, you know, kind of increasing the population if there's a reintroduced population there. So we might see that, say, birds from the Netherlands in time will join the population, and then of course increase the genetic variation of it.
Okay, thanks. A question here from Simon Watts. I mean, we have the white-tailed eagles breeding inland and at coastal areas. What's the approximate ratio, and presumably the prey choice is affected by that?
Yeah, when they're in inland areas, they tend to be in inland areas close to water. So somewhere like, you know, relevant to Leicestershire and Rutland Water would definitely be suitable for white-tailed eagles, you know, they would catch similar fish to the fish that ospreys are catching there, but they'll also take, you know, some of the water birds that winter. So, so in places like Poland, for example, they're a very, very big population. Poland's got somewhere in the region of 1,500 white-tailed eagles now, and the vast majority of that population is in inland areas around freshwater wetlands, and then there are some along the North Shore on the Baltic coast, something like 80 pairs up there. So, you know, it really varies according to the country. Some countries, somewhere like Finland, for example, they're predominantly coastal, but you get some in inland areas, again near water. But if they do breed inland, then they will be near water. It's, you know, because fish particularly is so important.
Okay, there's lots of complimentary messages coming in, I must say, about the talk, about how everybody found it very fascinating. A couple of related questions here, one from Alison Copeland and one from Craig Stewart. Really, when do they get their adult plumage, and when do you expect your birds to actually start to breed? You mentioned that they would be coming back to the Isle of Wight to breed. Is it likely to be soon?
Well, I mean, we're all kind of impatient for that to happen, but I think we're going to have to be patient, because they tend not to breed till they're 4 or 5 years old, which is also the time they kind of attain their full adult plumage. So the, you know, white-tailed eagles will be apparent in a few years' time. There is a chance with a population like this where you don't have, you know, the same amount of competition for nest sites in the early years, that some of these early release birds might try and breed a bit earlier. So they could breed at, say, 4 years old. And, you know, we have started to see some indications of kind of territorial disputes between some of the 2019 birds, but I think it's too early really for that to be happening yet. But one of the things that we will be doing, and as we've done very successfully with ospreys, is to build artificial nests for the white-tailed eagles, because we know that's worked in other parts of their range. And by doing that, you can influence settlement patterns, and you can encourage the birds to breed in really good areas. So that's probably something that we'll be looking to do this coming autumn. We've built one nest at the release site so far, but we're going to start building others, because we think that will be key to, you know, helping the population become established.
Okay, excellent, thanks. And then there's a whole cluster of questions here. Kaylee Wright, Rasa, Alan Herbert, Barry, and another one just come in. I see. Really thinking about, you did mention that the shooting fraternity down there seemed to quite welcome the presence, but, you know, there's obviously concerns about raptor persecution. You did mention that there's a fairly low survival rate of some of the younger ones, and just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit. Is it likely to be a problem?
I mean, we all know that raptor persecution is still a problem, a very big problem. And, you know, it's pretty awful that in 2021 we have to say that. I would say that to begin with. But I think we've also, you know, we have worked very hard to work closely with the game shooting interests, because, you know, that's integral to the birds becoming established. And it's important to try and build those relationships, and we've had some good support. So I hope that by, you know, taking that approach, you know, we will help the birds to become established. If you look at the natural prey availability in southern England, we hope that survival will actually be higher than was seen in Scotland. So, you know, that will hopefully help the population to become established. But we also know that there are potential anthropogenic causes of death apart from raptor persecution. So sadly, one of the 2020 birds flew into an electric power line after release last year and died. And if you look at kind of Europe, you see that a lot of birds are killed by collisions with, say, trains, wind turbines. In fact, anthropogenic causes of death are the highest cause of mortality for many populations of white-tailed eagles in Europe. So, you know, we have to be aware of that. But that's also why we are, you know, we're trying to work with as many different groups as possible who might perceive the white-tailed eagles as a threat, and hopefully trying to change some attitudes and perceptions, because, you know, we are building up some very detailed knowledge about how the birds are living in the landscape. And I think sadly, with all these things, a lot of people's initial kind of thoughts and impressions of a bird like this are based on kind of misinformation, conjecture, not helped by stuff being blown up in the divisions being blown up in the media, which really isn't helpful. So, you know, we're trying to tell the story as we're seeing it, as the data is showing, and we're using a really kind of evidence-based approach. And I hope people appreciate that, and hopefully that will stand the project in good stead.
Okay, thanks. That's great. A related question from David Duckett, actually. Really interested in the issue of lead shot in carrion. I mean, they
Yep.
obviously consume a lot of carrion, and I'm sure a lot of it does contain lead shot. Is that likely to be an issue?
Yeah, I mean, that, again, that's a relevant issue, because lead poisoning is an issue for white-tailed eagles elsewhere in Europe. So it's something that we're aware of, and something that with the steering group we've got, and as I say, we've got a broad representation on there. We're looking into. You know, we hope in this country that people are going to move away from lead shot. You know, we'll see how that progresses. But I think the pleasing aspect from our point of view is how the diet of the birds change in their kind of go from their first year into their second year. So what we're now seeing, as I mentioned, is that the second and third calendar year birds are starting to catch live. Well, they are favouring live prey. They're taking fish. They're taking water birds, and of course, because there is a really high abundance of readily available food like that, it drastically reduces the amount of carrion that the birds need to find in order to sustain themselves. So whilst carrion is very important in the first winter, we tend to see that it's less and less important as they get older. So hopefully that in itself will mean that, you know, accumulations of lead are less, but it is something that we're going to monitor going forward, because it may still be an issue.
Okay, excellent, thanks. A couple of questions about recording, actually. Is the talk being recorded? Well, it is being recorded, and if anybody would like to see it again, as I'm sure a lot of people would, it's available. If you go onto the booking page, there's a little button saying missed one of the talks. Just click on that, and it has the Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust list of talks that there's been, so you can catch up with anything you've missed. So that's good. One here from Pam Darby. Fantastic talk, Tim. Are there any plans to reintroduce birds to the wild Ken Hill project in Norfolk? Apparently the local farmers seem to be very keen for them to be there.
Yep, we've been talking and working with the Ken Hill estate in West Norfolk to look at the feasibility of a second release there as well. Again, this is a project, an area that was first proposed over 10 years ago by actually Natural England. It was identified as a highly suitable area. We've looked at it again, and we feel that's still the case. And with Ken Hill did a very big public consultation earlier this year, and there has been a lot of local support. There's also been concerns raised, and in the feasibility project study that we've done, we've tried to address some of those concerns. And it's helpful that the Isle of Wight birds are showing how these birds can coexist with some of the other native species. I think it's important to remember white-tailed eagle is a native species, and they're coexisting very well with other native species in southern England, and in fact also in West Norfolk, because some of the birds, G393 in particular, spent time there. So we're hopeful that project will go ahead, and if it does, then it's a bit like Wales. Then what it does is it creates another population and increases the chances of the species becoming really well established in southern Britain. So we hope that will happen, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. Of course, that it has to go through the same licensing procedure that the Isle of Wight project did. So time will tell, but there has been a lot of support, and I must say that the Ken Hill estate is an estate that's very, very forward thinking in how they're managing land. They're incorporating regenerative farming, rewilding into their kind of land use, and that I think that is just a really kind of inspirational story. And if we can add white-tailed eagles to the mix, then that will hopefully be of greater benefit as well.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks. Well, there's still plenty of complimentary notes coming in. That's great. Just a couple more questions here. A couple of questions about the tracking. Can the birding, one from Keith Jones, can the birding community access the tracking information? And a related one, I guess, is how long the tracking devices actually stay attached to the birds.
Yeah, well, yes, you can. We summarise the tracking data on the Foundation's website, and in fact, today I've been writing the latest update, which will be going online sometime in the next few days. We also have to be careful about what we publicise, because, of course, for quite lengthy periods, sometimes the birds are on private land with no access, and we have to kind of respect the kind of the land use that's going on there. So as much as we would love to publicise the location of every bird all the time, it's just not feasible. So what we're doing, hopefully, is a reasonable middle ground where we're summarising the movements. We also let the county recorders, there's obviously a network of county recorders across the country, and so when birds move to a new area, we're careful to notify them that a bird's moved into the area. So of course, then if there are reports, they know about the bird in question. And then if the birds go into, areas where they're easily publicly viewed and they can be seen, without kind of disturbance, then obviously they're publicised. A good example is when G393 went to Pitswood Reservoir the other day, and I was able to notify the Northampton County Recorder, and they put the news out, and lots of people saw the bird, which was really fantastic. Likewise, now G393 is at Poole Harbour, so he's a bird who's getting a bit of a following. He's giving a lot of people a lot of pleasure, hopefully.
Okay.
I should have said with the tracking, because the transmitters are solar powered, they can last for a number of years. So there's a golden eagle that Roy tagged in Scotland a number of years ago that's been transmitting for 11 years. So we're hopeful that they will continue to provide good data for a number of years yet.
Okay, great. Well, maybe we better make this a final question. I am aware of time. There's just one or two people noticed that an awful lot of the birds released in the Isle of Wight actually tend to fly north and a little bit east and west, but not a lot of sign of them going down onto the continent. Is that a bit strange? Is there a reason for that?
I think it's largely because of wind direction. So the prevailing wind, the southwesterlies, tend to push the birds north, and we definitely see that those longer exploratory flights are definitely influenced by the wind direction. So for example, when G324 went to Northumberland last year, there were really strong southerlies, and she flew that whole distance in 2 days. Likewise, when the two birds went to Land's End last autumn, it's because there were strong easterlies. So I think it's largely because of the prevailing wind direction, and also because they don't like making long sea cross. They don't like crossing the sea. So trying to cross to France or the Netherlands, it might happen in the future, but it's perhaps unlikely with a relatively small number of birds. I think the increasing number of continental white-tailed eagles we see in southern England now is just because those populations are getting larger, and some birds make it across, but it is still a relatively small number.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Well, I better draw the questioning to a stop now. There are still more questions coming in, and I'm really sorry to not be able to go through them all, because they're all really quite interesting questions. But really, I certainly thoroughly enjoyed that talk, Tim. Thank you ever so much, and thank you everybody for all your comments and all the questions that are continuing to come in, actually. So I better hand over to Kate now to draw this part of the evening together. But from me, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Thanks for handling all the questions so efficiently as well. And thank you to Tim for an absolutely brilliant, fascinating talk. As Dave says, there's been lots and lots of comments coming in. Personally, I found the tracking data really fascinating, just to see where the birds are going, where they're staying. And it'd be interesting to see what places they take up in the future years, really, and whether that has any association to this early data. But fantastic talk. thank you very much. Thank the photographer. A lot of those photographs are stunning, as you say. There's lots to digest there, and I'm just looking forward to seeing one coming overhead here one day soon. So thank you from everyone, and you can't hear clapping here, but anyway, clapping from us.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate, very much, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And yeah, glad that you've seemed to have found it interesting. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And yes, thank you to all the audience. If you could stay on for a few minutes longer to the audience, we're going to be showing a little video with some people in Charnwood. Artists in Charnwood have been producing artwork to support the Wildlife Trust's Meadow Appeal, and it is online now in an online live auction. The address for the auction site can be seen at the end of the video or on the Wildlife Trust site. So we'll be showing that in the interim in the next few minutes. And then if you people in, particularly in the Charnwood area, we have our AGM in about 5 minutes time. We'll be starting our AGM. So please, if you're local, please stay and watch that as well. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming. Thank you.